Recording by Susan Wade. Sketches of the Fair Sex in All Parts of the World by Anonymous. Chapter 8. Spanish Women. As the Spanish ladies are under a greater seclusion from general society than the sex is in other European countries, their desires of an adequate degree of liberty are consequently more strong and urgent. A free and open communication being denied them, they make it their business to secure themselves a secret and hidden one. Hence it is that Spain is the country of intrigue. The Spanish women are little or nothing indebted to education, but nature has liberally supplied them with a fund of wit and sprightliness, which is certainly no small inducement to those who have only transient glimpses of their charms, to wish very earnestly for a removal of those impediments that obstruct their most frequent presence. This not being attainable in a lawful way of customary intercourse, the natural propensity of men to overcome difficulties of this kind incites them to leave no expedient untried to gain admittance to what perhaps was at first only the object of their admiration, but which, by their being refused an innocent gratification of that passion, becomes at last the subject of a more serious one. Thus in Spain, as in all countries where the sex is kept much out of sight, the thoughts of men are continually employed in devising methods to break into their concealments. There is in the Spaniards a native dignity, which, though the source of many inconveniences, has nevertheless this salutary effect, that it sets them above almost every species of meanness and infidelity. This quality is not peculiar to the men. It diffuses itself in a great measure among the women also. Its effects are visible both in their constancy in love and friendship, in which respects they are the very reverse of the French women. Their affections are not to be gained by a bit of sparkling lace or a tawdry set of liveries. Their deportment is rather grave and reserved, and on the whole, they have much more of the prude than the coquette in their composition. Being more confined at home and less engaged in business and pleasure, they take more care of their children than the French, and have a becoming tenderness in their disposition to all animals, except a heretic and a rival. Something more than a century ago, the Marquis d'Astrogas, having prevailed on a young woman of great beauty to become his mistress, the Marchioness, hearing of it, went to her lodging with some assassins, killed her, tore out her heart, carried it home, made a ragout of it, and presented the dish to the Marquis. "It is exceedingly good," said he. "No wonder," answered she, "since it was made of the heart of that creature you so much doted on." And to confirm what she had said, she immediately drew out her head all bloody from beneath her hoop, and rolled it on the floor, her eyes sparkling all the time with a mixture of pleasure and infernal fury. A lady to whom a gentleman pays his addresses is sole mistress of his time and money, and should he refuse her any request, whether reasonable or capricious, it would reflect eternal dishonor upon him among the men, and make him the detestation of all the women. But in no situation does their character appear so whimsical, or their power so conspicuous, as when they are pregnant. In this case, whatever they long for, whatever they ask, or whatever they have an inclination to do, they must be indulged in. English women. The women of England are eminent for many good qualities, both of the head and of the heart. There we meet with that inexpressible softness and delicacy of manners, which, cultivated by education, appears as much superior to what it does without it, as the polished diamond appears superior to that which is rough from the mine. In some parts of the world, women have attained to so little knowledge and so little consequence that we consider their virtues as merely of the negative kind. In England, they consist not only in abstinence from evil, but in doing good. There we see the sex every day exerting themselves in acts of benevolence and charity, in relieving the distresses of the body and binding up the wounds of the mind, in reconciling the differences of friends and preventing the strife of enemies, and to sum up all, in that care and attention to their offspring which is so necessary and essential a part of their duty. A woman may succeed to the throne of England with the same power and privileges as a king, and the business of the state is transacted in her name, while her husband is only a subject. The king's wife is considered as a subject, but is exempted from the law which forbids any married woman to possess property in her own right during the lifetime of her husband. She may sue any person at law without joining her husband in the suit, may buy and sell lands without his interference, and she may dispose of her property by will, as if she were a single woman. She cannot be fined by any court of law, but is liable to be tried and punished for crimes by peers of the realm. The Queen Dowager enjoys nearly the same privileges that she did before she became a widow, and if she marries, a subject still continues to retain her rank and title. But such marriages cannot take place without permission from the reigning sovereign. A woman who is noble in her own right retains her title when she marries a man of inferior rank. But if ennobled by her husband, she loses the title by marrying a commoner. A peeress can only be tried by a jury of peers. In old times, a woman who was convicted of being a common mischief-maker and scold was sentenced to the punishment of the ducking stool, which consisted of a sort of chair fastened to a pole, in which she was seated and repeatedly let down into the water amid the shouts of the rabble. At Newcastle upon Tyne, a woman convicted of the same offense was led about the streets by the hangman with an instrument of iron bars fitted on her head like a helmet. A piece of sharp iron entered the mouth and severely pricked the tongue whenever the culprit attempted to move it. A great deal of vice prevails in England among the very fashionable and the very low classes. Misconduct and divorces are not unfrequent among the former, because their mode of life corrupts their principles, and they deem themselves above the jurisdiction of popular opinion. The latter feel as if they were beneath the influence of public censure, and find it very difficult to be virtuous on account of extreme poverty, and the consequent obstructions in the way of marriage. But the general character of English women is modest, reserved, sincere, and dignified. They have strong passions and affections, which often develop themselves in the most beautiful forms of domestic life. They are in general remarkable for a healthy appearance, and an exquisite bloom of complexion. Perhaps the world does not present a lovelier or more graceful picture than the English home of a virtuous family. Russian women. It is only a few years since the Russians emerged from a state of barbarity. A late empress of Russia, as a punishment for some female frailties, ordered a most beautiful young lady of family to be publicly chastised, in a manner which was hardly less indelicate than severe. It is said that the Russian ladies were formerly as submissive to their husbands in their families as the latter are to their superiors in the field, and that they thought themselves ill-treated if they were not often reminded of their duty by the discipline of a whip, manufactured by themselves, which they presented to their husbands on the day of their marriage. The latest travelers, however, assert that they find no remaining traces of this custom at present. Russian fathers of all classes generally arrange marriages for their children without consulting their inclinations. Among the peasantry, if the girl has the name of being a good housewife, her parents will not fail to have applications for her, whatever may be her age or personal endowments. As soon as a young man is old enough to be married, his parents seek a wife for him, and all is settled before the young couple know anything of the matter. Their nuptial ceremonies are peculiar to themselves, and formerly consisted of many whimsical rites, some of which are now disused. On her wedding day, the bride is crowned with a garland of wormwood, and after the priest has tied the nuptial knot, his clerk or sexton throws a handful of hops upon the head of the bride, wishing that she might prove as fruitful as that plant. She is then led home with abundance of coarse ceremonies, which are now wearing off even among the lowest ranks, and the barbarous treatment of wives by their husbands is either guarded against by the laws of the country or by particular stipulations in the marriage contract. In the conversation and actions of the Russian ladies, there is hardly anything of that softness and delicacy which distinguishes the sex in other parts of Europe. Even their exercises and diversions have more of the masculine than the feminine. The present empress, with the ladies of her court, sometimes divert themselves by shooting at a mark. Drunkenness, the vice of almost every cold climate, they are so little ashamed of, that not many years ago, when a lady got drunk at the house of a friend, it was customary for her to return next day and thank him for the pleasure he had done her. Females, however, in Russia, possess several advantages. They share the rank and splendor of the families from which they are sprung, and are even allowed the supreme authority. This, a few years ago, was enjoyed by an empress, whose head did honor to her nation and to her sex, although on some occasions the virtues of her heart have been much suspected. The sex in general are protected from insult by many salutary laws, and except among the peasants are exempted from every kind of toil and slavery. Upon the whole, they seem to be approaching fast to the enjoyment of that consequence to which they have already arrived in several parts of Europe. End of Chapter 8.
Section 9 of Sketches of the Fair Sex in All Parts of the World. Sketches of the Fair Sex in All Parts of the World, by Anonymous. The idea of female inferiority. It is an opinion pretty well established that in strength of mind as well as of body, men are greatly superior to women. Men are endowed with boldness and courage, women are not. The reason is plain: these are beauties in our character, in theirs they would be blemishes. Our genius often leads to the great and the arduous, theirs to the soft and the pleasing. We bend our thoughts to make life convenient, they turn theirs to make it easy and agreeable. If the endowments allotted to us by nature could not be easily acquired by women, it would be as difficult for us to acquire those peculiarly allotted to them. Are we superior to them in what belongs to the male character? They are no less so to us in what belongs to the female character. Would it not appear rather ludicrous to say that a man was endowed only with inferior abilities because he was not expert in the nursing of children and practicing the various effeminacies which we reckon lovely in a woman? Would it be reasonable to condemn him on these accounts? Just as reasonable as it is to reckon women inferior to men, because their talents are in general not adapted to tread the horrid path of war, nor trace the mazes and intricacies of science. The idea of the inferiority of female nature has drawn after it several others the most absurd, unreasonable, and humiliating to the sex. Such is the pride of man, that in some countries he has considered immortality as a distinction too glorious for women. Thus degrading the fair partners of his nature, he places them on a level with the beasts that perish. As the Asiatics have, time immemorial, considered women as little better than slaves, this opinion probably originated among them. The Mahometans, both in Asia and Europe, are said, by a great variety of writers, to entertain this opinion. Lady Montague, in her letters, has opposed this general assertion of the writers concerning the Mahometans, and says that they do not absolutely deny the existence of female souls, but only hold them to be of a nature inferior to those of men, and that they enter not into the same, but into an inferior paradise, prepared for them on purpose. Lady Montague, and the writers whom she has contradicted, may perhaps be both right. The former might be the opinion which the Turks brought with them from Asia. and the latter as a refinement upon it they may have adopted by their intercourse with the Europeans. This opinion, however, has had but few votaries in Europe, though some have even here maintained it, and assigned various reasons for so doing. Among these, the following laughable reason is not the least particular. "In the revelations of St. John the Divine," said one, whose wife was a descendant of the famous Xantippe, [Footnote: Xantippe was the wife of Socrates, and the most famous scold of antiquity.] "You will find this passage, 'And there was silence in heaven for about the space of half an hour.' Now I appeal to any one whether that could possibly have happened had there been any women there? And, since there are none there, charity forbids us to imagine that they are all in a worse place. Therefore it follows that they have no immortal part; and happy is it for them, as they are thereby exempted from being accountable for all the noise and disturbance they have raised in this world." In a very ancient treatise called The Wisdom of All Times, ascribed to Hushang, one of the earliest kings of Persia, are the following remarkable words: "The passions of men may, by long acquaintance, be thoroughly known, but the passions of women are inscrutable; therefore they ought to be separated from men, lest the mutability of their tempers should infect others." Ideas of a similar nature seem to have been at this time generally diffused over the East. For we find Solomon, almost everywhere in his writings, exclaiming against women; and, in the Apocrypha, the author of Ecclesiasticus is still more illiberal in his reflections. Both these authors, it is true, join in the most enraptured manner to praise a virtuous woman; but take care at the same time to let us know that she is so great a rarity as to be very seldom met with. Nor have the Asiatics alone been addicted to this illiberality of thinking concerning the sex. Satirists of all ages and countries, while they flattered them to their faces, have from their closets scattered their spleen and ill nature against them. Of this the Greek and Roman poets afford a variety of instances; but they must nevertheless yield the palm to one of our moderns. In the following lines Pope has outdone every one of them: "Men some to pleasure, some to business take, but every woman is at heart a rake." Swift and Dr. Young have hardly been behind this celebrated splenetic in illiberality. They perhaps were not favorites of the fair, and in revenge vented all their envy and spleen against them. But a more modern and accomplished writer, who by his rank in life, by his natural and acquired graces, was undoubtedly a favorite, has repaid their kindness by taking every opportunity of exhibiting them in the most contemptible light. "Almost every man," says he, "may be gained some way; almost every woman any way. Can anything exhibit a stronger caution to the sex?" It is fraught with information, and it is to be hoped they will use it accordingly. Female Simplicity. Would we conceive properly of that simplicity which is the sweetest expression of a well-formed and well-meaning mind, which everywhere diffuses tenderness and delicacy, sweetens the relations of life, and gives a zest to the minutest duties of humanity, let us contemplate every perceptible operation of nature, the twilight of the evening, the pearly dewdrops of the early morning, and all that various growth which indicates the genial return of spring. The same principle from which all that is soft and pleasing, amiable or exquisite, to the eye or to the ear, in the exterior frame of nature, produces that taste for true simplicity which is one of the most useful, as well as one of the most elegant lessons that ladies can learn. Infancy is, perhaps, the finest and most perfect illustration of simplicity. It is a state of genuine nature throughout. The feelings of children are under no kind of restraint, but pure as the fire, free as the winds, honest and open as the face of heaven. Their joys incessantly flow in the thickest succession, and their griefs only seem fleeting and evanescent. To the calls of nature they are only attentive. They know no voice but hers. Their obedience to all her commands is prompt and implicit. They never anticipate her bounties, nor relinquish her pleasures. This situation renders them independent of artifice. Influenced only by nature, their manners, like the principle that produces them, are always the same. Genuine simplicity is that peculiar quality of the mind by which some happy characters are enabled to avoid the most distant approaches to anything like affectation, inconsistency, or design, in their intercourse with the world. It is much more easily understood, however, than defined, and consists not in a specific tone of the voice, movement of the body, or mode imposed by custom, but is the natural and permanent effect of real modesty and good sense on the whole behavior. This has been considered in all ages as one of the first and most captivating ornaments of the sex. The savage, the plebeian, the man of the world, and the courtier are agreed in stamping it with a preference to every other female excellence. Nature only is lovely, and nothing unnatural can ever be amiable. The genuine expressions of truth and nature are happily calculated to impress the heart with pleasure. No woman, whatever her other qualities may be, was ever eminently agreeable but in proportion as distinguished by these. The world is good-natured enough to give a lady credit for all the merits she can possess or acquire without affectation. But the least shade or coloring of this odious foible brings certain and indelible obloquy on the most elegant accomplishments. The blackest suspicion inevitably rests on everything assumed. She who is only an ape of others, or prefers formality in all its gigantic and preposterous shapes to that plain unembarrassed conduct which nature unavoidably produces, will assuredly provoke an abundance of ridicule, but never can be an object either of love or esteem. The various artifices of the sex discover themselves at a very early period. A passion for expense and show is one of the first they exhibit. This gives them a taste for refinement, which divests their young hearts of almost every other feeling, renders their tempers desultory and capricious, regulates their dress only by the most fantastic models of finery and fashion, and makes their company rather tiresome and awkward than pleasing or elegant. No one perhaps can form a more ludicrous contrast to everything just and graceful in nature than the woman whose sole object in life is to pass for a fine lady. The attentions she everywhere and uniformly pays, expects, and even exacts, are tedious and fatiguing. Her various movements and attitudes are all adjusted and exhibited by rule. By a happy fluency of the most eloquent language, she has the art of imparting a momentary dignity and grace to the merest trifles. Studious only to mimic such peculiarities as are most admired in others, she affects a loquacity peculiarly flippant and teasing because scandal, routs, finery, fans, china, lovers, lapdogs, or squirrels are her constant themes. Her amusements, like those of a magpie, are only hopping over the same spots, prying into the same corners, and devouring the same species of prey. The simple and beautiful delineations of nature in her countenance, gestures, and whole deportment are habitually arranged, distorted, or concealed by the affected adoption of whatever grimace or deformity is latest or most in vogue. She accustoms her face to a simper which every separate feature in it belies. She spoils, perhaps, a blooming complexion with a profusion of artificial coloring. She distorts the most exquisite shape by loads or volumes of useless drapery. She has her head, her arms, her feet, and her gait equally touched by art and affectation, into what is called the taste, the ton, or the fashion. She little considers to what a torrent of ridicule and sarcasm this mode of conduct exposes her, or how exceedingly cold and hollow that ceremony must be which is not the language of a warm heart. She does not reflect how insipid those smiles are which indicate no internal pleasantry, nor how awkward those graces which spring not from habits of good nature and benevolence. Thus, pertness succeeds to delicacy, assurance to modesty, and all the vagaries of a listless to the sensibilities of an ingenuous mind. With her, punctilio is politeness, dissipation life, and levity spirit. The miserable and contemptible drudge of every tawdry innovation in dress or ceremony, she incessantly mistakes extravagance for taste, and finery for elegance. Her favorite examples are not those persons of acknowledged sincerity who speak as they feel and act as they think, but such only as are formed to dazzle her fancy, amuse her senses, or humor her whims. Her only study is how to glitter or shine, how to captivate and gratify the gaze of the multitude, or how to swell her own pomp and importance. To this interesting object all her assiduities and time are religiously devoted. How often is debility of mind, and even badness of heart, concealed under a splendid exterior! The fairest of the species and of the sex often want sincerity, and without sincerity every other qualification is rather a blemish than a virtue or excellence. Sincerity operates on the moral, somewhat like the sun on the natural world, and produces nearly the same effects on the dispositions of the human heart which he does on inanimate objects. Wherever sincerity prevails and is felt, all the smiling and benevolent virtues flourish most, disclose their sweetest luster, and diffuse their richest fragrance. Heaven has not a finer or more perfect emblem on earth than a woman of genuine simplicity. She affects no graces which are not inspired by sincerity. Her opinions result not from passion and fancy, but from reason and experience. Candor and humility give expansion to her heart. She struggles for no kind of chimerical credit, disclaims the appearance of every affectation, and is in all things just what she seems, and others would be thought. Nature, not art, is the great standard of her manners, and her exterior wears no varnish or embellishment which is not the genuine signature of an open, undesigning, and benevolent mind. It is not in her power, because not in her nature, to hide, with a fawning air and a mellow voice, her aversion or contempt, where her delicacy is hurt, her temper ruffled, or her feelings insulted. In short, whatever appears most amiable, lovely, or interesting, in nature, art, manners, or life, originates in simplicity. What is correctness in taste, purity in morals, truth in science, grace in beauty, but simplicity? It is the garb of innocence. It adorned the first ages, and still adorns the infant state of humanity. Without simplicity, woman is a vixen, a coquette, a hypocrite; society a masquerade, and pleasure a phantom. The following story, I believe, is pretty generally known. A lady, whose husband had long been afflicted with an acute but lingering disease, suddenly feigned such an uncommon tenderness for him as to resolve on dying in his stead. She had even the address to persuade him not to outlive this extraordinary instance of her conjugal fidelity and attachment. It was instantaneously agreed they should mutually swallow such a quantity of arsenic as would speedily effect their dreadful purpose. She composed the fatal draught before his face, and even set him the desperate example of drinking first. By this device, which had all the appearance of the greatest affection and candor, the dregs only were reserved for him, and soon put a period to his life. It then appeared that the dose was so tempered, as, from the weight of the principal ingredient, to be deadly only at the bottom, which she had artfully appropriated for his share. Even after all this finesse, she seized, we are told, his inheritance, and insulted his memory by a second marriage. End of Section 9. Recording by Trisha G.